So welcome today to the I3h seminar. We are very pleased to welcome I3h KESTERNICH with us today. She's a professor of behavioral economics at KU Leuven. I3h has got a PhD in economics from the University of Munich. Initially, she was focusing more on insurance and international economics, but she has been shifting towards more behavioral studies, among others, of physicians. She has a very impressive CV. With publications in top journals like the Review of Economic Studies, the Economics Journal, the Journal of Public Economics, the Journal of Health Economics, and I spotted this very well-titled paper, Physician Behavior, Homo Economicus or Homo Hippocraticus, which I guess summarizes well this kind of research that I3h is leading. So I3h, thank you so much for accepting to participate in our seminar series today, with a paper on competition between for-profit and not-for-profit homes in the long-term healthcare market.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. And also, I already said, please do go ahead and ask questions because I want to make sure that as many of you as possible can follow. I know it's a bit of an mixed audience. It's sometimes a bit technical paper, but I will try to explain the formula as well. But if you get lost, please ask me questions. And also if you have other questions. And as I said, I also do more applied research in behavioral economics. So if you want to talk to me about this at some point, just feel free to do so. But let's first talk about this paper now. It's a joint work with a former PhD student of mine, Iris Grant, who now works at Intermut, you know, the nice place that gives us all the Belgian health data, and with my colleague Johannes van Biesebroek. So let me see how I can move forward here. So the healthcare market is one of the fastest growing markets in the long-term care market. In Germany, we saw an increase of 46% in the number of residents between 1999 and 2013. And one of the reasons is changes in labor force participation of women, but the main reason is a large increase in the elderly population, both in shares as in absolute numbers, and further increases are predicted. So you can see here in the graph, that's the population share of elderly in Germany. And if you look, for example, at the 65 plus here in blue, you can really see that this is projected to increase by quite a lot until 2035. The estimated need for additional investment in Germany is about 54 to 73 billion euros. So there's totally need for additional capacity. Something else that's interesting about the long-term care market is that two types of long-term care homes compete in the same market. So we have non-profit and for-profit homes in the same market. And we have a similar situation in education, healthcare, and research. In fact, the non-profit sector has become very important in many sectors and countries. In the US, 10% of total employment and 15% of the employment in the healthcare industry is in the non-profit sector. And in Germany, Caritas, which is basically the firm of the Catholic Church, is the biggest employer with over 500,000 employees. So here I drew recent entry patterns, and you can see that most of the entry in the last 1.5 decades in the long-term care market has been by for-profit homes in red, followed by non-profit homes in black, and net entry in the public firms has actually been negative because the government is pulling out of this sector. So what we want to do in this paper is we want to analyze competition between for-profit and non-profit homes. And we're especially interested in whether this competition is asymmetric, in the sense that for-profit entry might be deterred more by the presence of other for-profit homes rather than by non-for-profit homes, and vice versa. More specifically, we know that for-profit entry remains crucial for meeting future demand increases, but non-profit firms have a competitive advantage. So they might get subsidies from the ultimate owners, and they're exempted from certain taxes. So what we want to know is whether the presence of non-profit firms will hinder for-profit entry. And then secondly, we know that the press and much of the academic literature worries about relative quality of for-profit homes. Rather than evaluating this with a demand model, where we would need some observable metric of quality, so we would just have to say, okay, we think quality is this variable, we'll use a revealed preference approach, and we want to know whether consumers see for-profits and non-profits as differentiated product. And third, we observe that over time, the attributes of for-profits and non-profits become more similar, and we want to know whether through competing with each other, maybe their behavior is also becoming more similar. And last, I show you several policy simulations. One is to what would happen if the government would close the remaining public long-term care homes. Second is what would happen if we would eliminate the tax advantage that benefits the non-profit homes. And last is a quality regulation, namely to mandate a minimum share of single-person rooms in each home. For each of these policy simulations, we want to see whether vulnerable markets remain unserved or underserved. And we also want to just predict future market growth and see what we think will happen with entry. Is there any question?
Question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we like to have the two sectors competing is often because the public sector will then maintain the overall price of the sector lower. So some of the effect may be on the overall price index, that the other firms cannot increase their price because you have this alternative. So what can you say about that?
Yeah, so interesting enough, as you will see later, at least in Germany, it's the non-profit firms who are the high-price firms. So it's actually the for-profit firms who are serving the kind of low price, maybe even low quality sector. So I think this is, at least in Germany, it's not the case, but it's possible, especially if we look at the public firms, that this might be the case. But the public sector is really in Germany really not very important. Just about 5% of the firms are public. So I wouldn't think that they have a big impact on the market. Are there any further questions up to here?
Well, it's Mathias de I3h here. So, and maybe you've already answered my question, because I thought you started by saying there are three types of firms. So public, for-profit, and not-for-profit. And then you stressed the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit. But then I thought, but what about the disciplining effect of public firms? But you're saying only 5%, so it's...
And they're really like slowly getting out of the market. So I think the idea of the German government is really to leave the market slowly.
And is this something which is uncontroversial? Is the view that they are not efficient, or is at some level?
Yeah, it's.
And by the way, I understand that is Caritas just Catholic or Catholic and Protestant? Because I understand your country has both.
Yeah. So okay. So first of all, so interestingly enough, much of this exit by the public firms happens quite decentrally, because it's often just public financing questions, and then if there are enough homes, private homes and non-profit homes, then the government decides, okay, we anyway don't have a lot of money, let's close this one as well. So it's really like slowly, and I'm not sure. I would have to see. I always hear the discussions about the non-profit sector, because I guess that Germans think it's very normal that the churches will provide this service. They've always done so, right? Like even in the kind of medieval times, who would provide care? It would be the church, right? Both the Catholic and the Protestant church. Unfortunately, we are not allowed to control for this in our regressions, by the way. But it's of course not that these homes can say we only take, let's say, Catholic consumers or something, because they get public subsidies, so they have to take people of any belief. But I haven't heard a lot of people being against this, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that they are, in any case, subsidized by the state and therefore regulated, I guess.
They're regulated, yeah. And it's the same with like, let's say, Catholic schools. They even are forced to take a certain share of people of the other belief. But so I think this is the idea that this denomination shouldn't matter much. But I guess if you're an elderly person who hates the churches, then you will be happy that the for-profit homes are there, right? Yeah.
It may depend on the price, but if you say the price is lower, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Of course, there is quality, of course.
Yeah, there's quality. So let's look a bit at the observables about quality that we have. So we will contribute to 3 strands of literature. Competition in the long-term care market, mainly ask the question, is competition good or bad for quality provision? Then there's a big literature on the competition between non-profit and for-profit providers, but this is mainly for hospitals, not for long-term care homes. And then we'll estimate entry models. So there's a literature on 2-type entry games. Mainly the closest related paper is the paper by Harrison and Syme, who look at the competition between for-profit and non-profit gyms in the US. So maybe a bit about the German long-term care market. So why would we think that Germany is an ideal country to study the strategic interaction between non-profit and for-profit firms? So first of all, because Germany has one of the largest shares of the 75+ population in the world. Also, unlike in the US, entry of long-term care homes is free. So all you need is you have to meet certain staffing and housing requirements, and then every one of you could open a long-term care home. And we have a rich administrative data set on long-term care institutions. And unlike in Belgium, we think that Germany is big enough to think about geographically separated markets. As I already said, historically, non-profits dominated the market. So it was the churches who would provide care. In the German law, a non-profit firm has to pursue benevolent purposes. Non-profit firms are constrained to distribute their profit back to the ultimate owners, and they're exempted from a lot of the taxes. So we think in our simulation, we think that they don't pay, would say 30% is the tax rate that they are not having to pay. In 2000,
I'm sorry, are there constraints on how much they pay their management?
No, I wouldn't know. So this could be, of course, one way to, give money at least to one interest group. You could pay the management a lot. I would have to look this up. I'm not sure. But I mean, the main constraint is that they, it's not that these homes make huge profits and the Catholic Church pockets these profits.
Okay, because I think on hospitals, there is work by Marianne Bertrand and co-authors in the US showing that with more competition from for-profit hospital, then not-for-profit hospitals start giving more financial incentives to their management, and that dilutes their not-for-profit purpose. And in fact, they show that it then reduces their donations. So because they are somehow, because donors understand they are being contaminated by the profit motive.
By the profit motive. Yeah. Okay, so this I would have to check. I wouldn't know that there's something in the German law. I've never seen something, but I would have to really look again.
Iris?
Yeah.
We have an additional question from Gani Aldashev from I3h. I suppose that quality is different from diversity. All consumers might prefer better services, but not all agree on having a certain religious aspect attached. Do you distinguish between these 2 dimensions empirically?
No, so we look at the entry model, but this is in a way good and bad. So we do not take any stance on what is quality, for example, for consumers. We really just see how consumers behave. But if we see, for example, that they prefer the non-profit homes, we wouldn't know whether they prefer them because they're higher quality or whether they actually like to be in a religious home or vice versa with the for-profit homes. In 2013, the for-profit homes have caught up by quite a lot. So 54% of the homes are non-profit and 40% are for-profit. And public institutions with 5%, as I said, just play a marginal role. consumers are free to choose between homes. They usually choose a home very locally, very close to their last place of residence. In Germany, there is mandatory long-term care insurance that pays out a fixed amount every month. This covers only about 40% of total costs. So the out-of-pocket payment for a consumer is really considerable. It's about 1,500 euros per month, or in a recent newspaper article, I read that it was even 2,000 euros per month. If someone cannot pay this anymore, then social assistance will step in. Prices are set as a bargaining between the individual long-term care facility on the one hand, an insurance company and social assistance on the other hand. Entry is free under certain minimum requirements on the staffing and building. The data set that we're going to be using is the Pflegestatistik. It's an administrative data set that covers all German care institutions, their patients and employees. And we have data on every 2 years between 1999 and 2013. And we'll add city and district level variables like population size or income. So maybe this is interesting to you, some information on prices and also on some variables that are considered quality measures, number of residents, full-time equivalent nurses per resident, and the share of single rooms, and how they are different between non-profit and for-profit homes and how they change over time. So as you see with prices, the prices are actually higher in the non-profit firms. Interestingly enough, prices decline over time, but the price difference between non-profit and for-profits remains relatively stable. Regarding the number of residents, here for-profit firms do better because people prefer smaller homes. But over time, you see that we see convergence between for-profit and non-profit homes. Then the mostly discussed quality measure is full-time equivalent nurses per resident. And this is the thing that people worry about most. Are there too few nurses in a home? And here, interestingly enough, non-profit and for-profit homes look really pretty much the same across all our sampled period. Regarding the share of single rooms, that's maybe something that consumers value most. Here, for-profit firms did pretty badly in the beginning of the sample period, but again, we see convergence. Yeah, so when we look at observable quality, it seems that non-profit and for-profit firms converge. Is there a question here?
Can I ask just a quick question? So what about, are there like waiting lists? I don't know how the German situation works, but like I know that in some countries you typically have very long waiting lists, which might you might find a difference. So in one type of institutions, the waiting list is shorter than in the other. Do you also have any type of information with respect to that?
So, and I know, for example, in the US, because they have restricted entry, there's pretty long waiting lists. In Germany, we actually can see the total capacity in the data and the number of patients, and it's only about 90% of the capacity is taken on average. So it might have to be that in a specific home, you might have to wait a bit, but there are no long waiting lists. And like I also talked to someone from a long-term care home, and they said, yeah, unfortunately, because people regularly die, normally places get available on a regular basis normally.
Great, thank you.
So we know that the average travel time between the last place of residence and a long-term care home is usually smaller than 10 minutes. So we, when we thought about the market definition, we thought that Germany's 402 districts with on average 23 homes would be too big a market definition, while Germany's 11,000 municipalities with less than a home on average would be too small. So we actually went and constructed local markets by combining municipalities if their centers are close, and close meaning that they are less than 5, 7.5 or 15 kilometers apart, depending on the urbanization level. Here our idea is if you live in a less urbanized region, you're willing to travel a bit further. So below here you see our resulting about 2,054 markets, and the combination of non-profit and for-profit homes. So one thing to note is that there are quite a lot of market, 185, that are served neither by for-profit or non-profit homes, and that the most frequent combination is a non-profit monopoly. And then if you look at the diagonal and the off-diagonal, there are always more firms on the off-diagonal. So basically this is quite an asymmetric distribution. It's not that, you know, non-for-profits and for-profits always equally distribute in the markets. So before I get to the theoretical and the empirical model, let's just, I just want to remind us of the goal of this study. So we want to study the degree of competition between homes of the same type, where a type is to be a non-profit or for-profit home, compared to competition between different types. And the problem is that simply regressing the number of other type firms on the number of own type firms doesn't work, because there might be unobserved market characteristics that make the market attractive for both type of firms. So we have an endogeneity problem here. Realistically, we won't be able to find instruments, because demand and cost shifters will also likely be correlated with market-specific unobservables, for example, the tightness of the labor markets. And policy change, we might be able to find a policy change that helps us to identify the effects of, let's say, the presence of one type on the other, but to find two policy changes at the same time that help us to identify both sides of effects is really very unlikely. So our solution is that we turn to structure and we model both types decisions explicitly. One problem when we do this is that profits are unobserved. Yeah, maybe you can observe accounting profits if you have the right data, but economic profits are always unobserved. So the solution that was proposed by this seminal paper in the entry literature by Bresnan and Rees was to learn about unobserved profits. We'll use the observed market equilibrium, where the market equilibrium is the number of firms of each type in the market. And we say that the observed market structure results from the profit maximizing decisions of both incumbents and potential competitors. So let's say we observe n firms of each type in the market, then we say that n firms make profits, but n+1 firms would not make profits because otherwise we would have seen entry. Yeah, this is the basic idea of this literature. So one thing that you might find a bit strange here is that I said profit maximizing decisions, but we are thinking about non-profit firms here, right? So let's for now just say that firms enter when their objective function is positive, whatever this is. And for-profit, we say that they engage in standard profit maximization. While for non-profit firms, we borrow from the public economic literature, and we say that they engage in profit maximization with lower effective marginal costs. Now, why is this? The argument is as follows. We say that non-profit firms maximize profits plus something else. This something else might be output, so that they directly care about the amount of care that they provide. But whatever they maximize, they deviate from the profit maximizing quantity, and this deviation has to be covered by donors' wealth. So while for a for-profit firm, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, for a non-profit firm, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost minus the marginal rate of substitution between output and profit. So the idea here is the more the producer values output relative to profits, the smaller will be the total marginal costs net of this monetized utility from output. Yeah, so the more they will want to produce. And tax advantages for non-profit firms will generate the same effects. Yeah?
Iris, can I ask a couple of questions here?
Yeah.
The first, a clarifying one concerning the quality. So my understanding that given that sometimes we're talking about very old people, there is, at least from my informal perception, quite a substantial moral hazard problem. Often is that the quality of the care is unobservable, and very elderly people are unable to respond to the quality. So very often it's the children who have to decide, and they don't know what's happening inside the home often. So to some extent, that might justify why nonprofits are there, because we have a classic paper that was a Glaser and Schleifer, I think, that justified essentially the unobservable quality, the incompleteness of the contract, as a justification why nonprofit might actually be a good solution to it. So I don't know how serious the problem is here.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question concerning the modeling choice about nonprofits, I don't know whether it's a standard in this literature, but my understanding is that it looks a little bit non-conventional, because nonprofit typically is defined by non-distribution constraint, but it says nothing about its objective. So therefore, there is a little bit of the arbitrariness in choosing what the objective of nonprofit is. Very often in the theory, you choose something like a mission orientation and you maximize something towards the mission, which is not the case here. So is it a convenience-driven choice, or is it something which is standard in this literature?
Okay, two things. So first, I think in a way I agree that quality is something fundamentally unobservable, and this is also why we don't really estimate the demand model, but we use this entry model. So we do not have to, assume that people have to really observe quality. In fact, I can tell you two things. So first, when we talked to long-term care home, they said consumers really care much more about the fact whether there's parking in front of the house or whether the entrance hall is light and whether people say the food is good, then they would care about quality as we as researchers would, at least when they enter, right? Because they do not know about the other aspects. But that's I think one of the reasons why we estimate an entry model and not a normal demand model. And then actually what we do here, it is pretty standard in the public economics literature. So what we say is that, and as you see it on the next slide, that there is actually a mission orientation. So that there's an altruism parameter, and that the nonprofits care directly about the care that they provide, so that they really want to care for as many patients as possible, or at least they will deviate from profit maximization. Yeah, so I think it's a bit similar to mission orientation. Are there more questions here?
Yes, I'm wondering, imagine you have a very cynical entrepreneur who wants to start a home long-term care, and that entrepreneur just wants to maximize his payoff. So with fixed objectives, he may want to choose the for-profit if he expects a lot of money coming out and he cannot spend it, or to shift the official form of the company into not-for-profit because total profits would be smaller and therefore you can pay yourself in other ways, but at least you avoid some taxes.
So yeah, there's also a bit of this. There's also something about this in the literature, right? Like I think a wolf in sheepskin paper, for example. So I guess honestly that this would be difficult in Germany because, to my knowledge, almost all nonprofit firms are led by the church. So I suppose that because in the law it says that they have to follow benevolent purposes. So I think it might be hard for you or me to argue that we start a firm for benevolent purposes. I think it would be just hard to prove for a private person, and this is why it doesn't happen.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, then thank you, and maybe just to look more. So why do we have a theoretical model at all? I think mainly to get us thinking a bit about this profit, non-profit motives and about the assumptions that we make in the empirical model. So we really chose the simplest theoretical model possible. And we looked at the type of things that we'll assume in the empirical model later on. So especially we are always interested in what happens with entry and market size. Yeah. So we assume that goods are homogeneous and firms are symmetric within type, and firms compete strategically in Cournot fashion. And we actually say that for-profit and non-profit firms have different objective functions. So for-profit firms will simply maximize profits. Profits being price minus marginal cost times quantity minus fixed cost. Very simple. A non-profit firm will have also, they care about their profits. They have to make profits to exist on the long run. But they have this additional term here, delta times Q, where delta is our altruism parameter or output preference or mission parameter if you want. And what you see is that if you just rearrange terms, and this is what I meant with lower effective marginal cost, it looks like profit maximization, just that this altruism makes the non-profit firms have lower effective marginal costs, where this is driven by the fact that they want to, provide care even if it's not at the profit maximizing quantity. Then we're thinking about representatives consumers who has linear demand for both goods, for profit and non-profit. And the demand will decrease in both the quantity provided of for-profit and non-profit firms. We have this strange formulation here that we always use aggregate quantity divided by the market size, because we are, as you see in the empirical model, we are especially interested in seeing what happens when a market grows. Will there be entry? Will there not be entry? Yeah, this is why we chose this specification. Also, in any sensible demand model, you would always think that these B's will be larger than the D's, so that the demand will be lowered more by the own type firm than by the other type firm. So,
Iris, may I ask a question again, going back on the previous slide? So one thing which slightly disturbs me, but because of the type of application we're looking at here, I thought it would be more natural to model it as a kind of a Salop circle where each consumer chooses only one. And since you also mentioned in the introduction that these people cared about the distance physically from home, it would have, and in a Salop circle you can actually study entry, yeah? So that so I thought that, and here moreover they don't buy continuous quantity or more than one. They typically choose which place to go to, and there's a continuum of them. So it's a little bit somehow non-standard in terms of a type of a model for the type of thing that you want to study, because how do I think about the more than one quantity, so quantity larger than one if I'm a consumer?
So no, and actually in the empirical application, we just think that every consumer will choose exactly one type of firm, right? But I think it's still the case that you have a demand for long-term care that will go down with the price, because you might have other ways, for example, so to there might be an outside goods, and you might if non-profit firms are very expensive, you might go for the for-profit firms and so on. But you're right, it's an interesting question. Why not? But Salop type of circle you would think of, because we're not thinking about differentiated firms here at all, because also we so you would think Salop type of circle with a type of physical distance from how far away you are from a home, or how would you think about this Salop circle? Okay, so because I think we have to discuss this later further, because I wouldn't fully understand how you're thinking about the the distance here. I mean, one thing is that of course we do not observe where actual consumers are living and to which actual home they go. So this would be, if you're really thinking of physical distance, that would be kind of due to data limitations, we couldn't do this. And here we just want to basically, this theoretical model is really just to order our thoughts with respect to certain things. So one thing would be that we would think that because of this output preference, a non-profit firm would want to offer a larger quantity at a lower price. Yeah, we're thinking here of firm behavior more than of consumer behavior. And the second thing is that we really want to see.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Patrick Legros, hi.
Hello.
Yeah, the question, I was wondering if Cournot is really the right modeling choice. I know in France, for instance, there is a lot of difference in quality among different homes, but this is also because there is a wide variety of ability to pay by seniors. So you have people who are pretty rich, people who are pretty poor. And quality is expensive. It doesn't go, by the way, you may want to have fewer people in your home and more nurses, rather than having more patients in the. So I would have thought that actually a model of differentiation among homes on the basis of quality would have been perhaps a more salient model. Yeah.
So one thing you're certainly right. If you really want to think about how these homes, like position themselves in the product market, then we would really have to think about a model of product differentiation. Why we chose the most simple Cournot model here is first because this theoretical model is just there to kind of order our thoughts, but also because these entry models always assume homogeneous firms within type, right? And this is a clear restriction of what we're doing. But for entry model, you cannot really think about differentiation within type. So what will be for us the three takeaways from the theoretical models? So I think 1 and 2 are really pretty non-surprising. Namely, the payoffs are decreasing at a diminishing rate in the number of own type and other type firms. And I think even if you would write down a more complicated model, you would get the same thing. By the way, in our model, quality would be captured in this A parameter here, yeah, that shifts up and down the demand curve. And then the second thing is also maybe not very surprising, namely the effects on both objective function are larger for entry by the same type firms than for entry by the other type firms. So you're competing more within type. And maybe the more surprising thing is here number 3, namely the ordering of the own type effects. So how much do your profits fall if you see entry by someone from your own type is the same as the effective price cost margins. So let's assume for a moment that quality, basically these A's, and marginal cost, the C's, are the same between for-profit and non-for-profit firms. Then this altruism parameter here, the delta, would lead to the effective price cost margin being lower for non-profit firms. And this would actually mean that they compete harder with each other. Yeah, so this additional motive of providing care makes them being harder competitors with their own type, with the non-profit firms. What's maybe important is that we will not impose these inequalities, but we'll verify them in the estimates, and that results 1 and 2 are necessary for unique subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. Now, this was just to think a bit about what we'll see in the empirical specification. What will we do? We'll estimate parameters. For the profit, we'll use a reduced form latent profit equation, but we use a structural model of firm entry behavior, where, as said, the observed market structure will tell us something about unobserved profits. In this entry literature, there are 3 standard assumptions, and this is also one of the reasons that we looked at the theory, just to see will we get are these assumptions sensible in our setting? Namely, homes of the same type are substitutes, homes of different types are at least weak substitutes, and own type effects are stronger than other type effects. What we will then do is we use the standard trick from a discrete choice model. We say that profits are made up of an observed part, and I'll show you on the next slide what this observed part is, and an unobserved part, something that the researcher cannot observe. Note that for each market, we think that non-profit and for-profit firms, they basically draw their separate shocks. And the only thing that's maybe a bit unusual here for discrete choice model is that the shock here enters negatively. That's just, you know, you can put it as however you want, but it will just change how we write up things. If we make this assumption, then we can learn from the observed number of firms, we can learn something about the unobserved shock. Yeah, so if we see n firms in the market, we know that this shock must have been small enough to allow that n firms make profits, but the shock was too big to allow n+1 firms in the market. We make a distributional assumption about this shock. We say that it's bivariate normally distributed with correlation coefficient rho to capture common shocks. So we allow the shocks of profit and non-profit firms to be correlated. And we'll estimate a bivariate order probit model with correction for multiple Nash equilibria. And I show you some graphs in 2 slides to make this more, yeah, I hope understandable. So as I said, for the profits, we use reduced form latent profit functions. So we say that the observable profits are a function of log market size, of some market characteristics, for example, market income, and of the number of own and other type competitors in the market. Let me just drink a bit of water. About the effect of the own and other type firms, the gammas and the alphas, note that we just parameterize them in the way that they give incremental effects, so always the effect of one additional firm. And also if I show you the empirical results later on, note that we have a minus sign here in front of them. So a positive estimate tells you that another firm will decrease profits. Then it may be, why do we divide the number of other type firms by the number of own type firms that are already in the market? Well, because we think that one more other type firm, let's say one more for-profit firm in the market, will have a smaller effect when there are already 4 non-profit firms than when there's only 1. Yeah, and to get to just this, we divide the other type effect by n. Note also that all coefficients that we'll estimate here are, as in any discrete choice model, scaled by the unobserved variance of the error term. So we cannot really compare coefficients between equations. But before I come to the estimates, I want to show you some graphs so that it gets clearer what I mean with this multiple Nash equilibria. So let's say, assume for now that non-profit and for-profit firms are strategically independent. So they're operating completely different markets. You know, consumers who choose non-profit firms always do so. They're really not interested in the for-profit firms in the market and vice versa. What then happens is we do not have multiple Nash equilibria, because if the shocks, let's say, of the for-profit and the non-profit firms here are very large, remember they're negative, these shocks, then we cannot have any firm in the market. If both shocks are very small, then we can, let's say, have 2 for-profit and 2 non-profit firms in the market. And there might be also asymmetric situations. For example, here, the for-profit shock is very big, so there cannot be any for-profit firm, but the non-profit shock is very small, so we can have 2 of them in the market. But unfortunately, when we say that these firms strategically interact with each other, so that consumers, you know, even if they have a preference for-profit firms, maybe they do still consider to choose a non-profit firm also, then we have these multiple Nash equilibria here. So this whole area, we know that there'll be 2 firms in the market, but we do not know whether this will be 2 for-profit firms, 2 non-profit firms, or 1 of each. How do we solve this problem? Well, by making an additional assumption. We make the assumption that non-profit firms always enter first. This is due to motivated first by history, because they were there first, and second by economic theory, because we think that this kind of altruism parameter will make them enter the market earlier at a lower market size. Yeah? But I show you, and in the empirical results, we see that this assumption isn't really very important. So when you see this area with the multiple equilibria, how would we distribute this? Well, we always prefer the equilibrium here with normal non-profit firms. So here we always say we have the 2-0 equilibrium, and here we have the 1-1 equilibrium. Are there any questions to this kind of how we deal with the Nash equilibria here? Okay, if not.
Yes, just a very quick one. Yeah. Do you observe a constant number of beds per inhabitants in equilibrium?
No. So the firms have different sizes, and this is, of course, another.
This is what I was asking.
Yeah, it is another kind of limitation of our entry model that we cannot allow for. I mean, it's not that one type of firm is kind of double the size of the other, but it's an assumption that we have to make that firms are homogeneous, and yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So let me first show you the results only for the year 2013 and show you the parameter estimates for the non-profit firms in the first column and the for-profit firms in the second column. Oops, I'm always moving too much. So first note that we get sensible estimates for the control variables. So for example, larger markets, profits will be larger. The number of public firms we use as control here, and they decrease the profits for both non-profit and for-profit firms. In Eastern Germany, profits of for-profit firms are lower. And interestingly enough, we do not find that these firms prefer the highest income markets. In fact, the for-profit firms even prefer the kind of lower income markets. So maybe this is because they have the lower price. And then the variables that we're really interested in are these kind of own type effects and other type effects, because we want to learn about competition from them. Yeah? And first note that the own type effects, and remember, these are kind of incremental, right? After the first one, the own type effects, the profits are always negatively affected by other competitors of the own type, and kind of each additional competitor has a bit of smaller effect. Yeah, so these incremental effects get smaller. A bit surprising maybe the other type effects, because while we see that non-profit firms are hurt by the presence of for-profit firms do not seem to be affected by the presence of non-profit firms. When we look at the unobserved market-specific effects, so the correlation between the effects for non-profit and for-profit firms, this correlation is not significant, but the point estimate is negative. So for-profit and non-profit firms seem to like different type of markets. This you already saw when we looked at the market structure, that this is quite asymmetric. When we make the reverse order of entry assumption, so we assume that the for-profit firms enter first, results are very similar, so we think that multiple Nash equilibria are not a big problem in our setting. And then last but not least, unfortunately, we can compare estimates within one equation, right? So we can say, for example, the effects are decreasing with additional entry for the first, second, third, and fourth firm. But we cannot compare parameters across equations because they're scaled by the unobserved variance, and we do not know what this is. In order to deal with this problem, we use entry thresholds, where entry thresholds are the minimum population required for a given number of homes to break even. What is the idea here? So entry thresholds are scale-free measures of competition. So they have the same units as market size. So I will tell you, a long-term care home will break even when there are 4,000 elderly over 75 in the market, let's say. These entry thresholds are smaller if margin of fixed costs are smaller. So if you're able to offer your product as a lower cost, you need less consumers to cover your fixed costs. What happens with entry? What we think is that entry will increase competition, so it will lower price cost margins, and thus there will be a larger market needed to support an additional firms. Yeah, so the more firms we have, the larger will be the market that they need to support one additional firm. How do we get at these entry thresholds? Well, we actually just solve for the market size that makes profits be equal to 0. Yeah, we solve for this at our estimated parameters and at the average market characteristics. Often we are interested in the entry threshold per firm. So each firm needs 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 consumers to break even. And we have different entry thresholds for both types. And importantly, this will depend on the number of own and other type homes in the market. Are there any questions on what the entry threshold is? Okay, if not, then I move to show you our entry thresholds. We have the entry thresholds of non-profit firms here in the left panel, of the for-profit firms in the right panel. And the entry thresholds that you see here are the entry thresholds first for a monopoly, duopoly, 3 firms, and 4 or more firms. So one thing to note is that the monopoly entry thresholds are very stable over time for both types. Yeah, so either demand and costs parameters didn't change a lot over our sample period in Germany, or they exactly offset each other. Then one thing to note is that we use a different scale here. For the non-profits, we go from 500 to 2,000 consumers. For the for-profits, we go from 1,000 to 4,000. So actually, these monopoly entry thresholds are much larger for for-profit firms. And this would be predicted by our simple model, right? So that these for-profit firms might have higher effective marginal costs, or might also simply be that consumers dislike for-profit firms, so that these firms have a harder time entering. What's also important to see is that entry thresholds are larger in markets with more competitors. So yes, long-term care homes do compete with each other, and competition gets fiercer the more firms are in the market. And last, these entry thresholds for high-end, they fall over time, and they fall especially strongly for for-profit firms. So maybe there was a change in the number of competition, so that for-profit firms over time, they have learned to live with each other in a market. And what's also interesting, I think, is that in the beginning of the sample period, really for-profit and non-profit looked very different. And in the end of the sample period in 2013, they look very similar. So maybe for-profit firms learned, or consumers are less apprehensive of the presence of for-profit firms in the market. Are there any questions here on the entry thresholds?
There's actually a question from my side. Iris, could you clarify to me whether you consider all patients equal? Because a lot of people might enter just as common elderly without serious comorbidities, but I can imagine that on your staffing, there's a serious pressure if you have much more patients having serious comorbidities, no? Which might actually impact your profit?
Yeah, so okay, so several things on this. In Germany, there are these, so here we really just use market size being the population over 75. And it's true that this population might be made different, be differentially ill in different places. What is the case in Germany is that able to be allowed to get the subsidies, you have to have your health level verified. And there are 3 health levels, 1, 2, or 3. I haven't heard of a lot of, let's say, fraud in this market of verifying your health level. And the subsidies increase. And also, so hopefully for the homes, these increases in subsidies should reflect the costs that increase with the number of patients. The patient mix between for-profit and non-profit firms is not so different. So it seems the same kind of health level sort in 2 types of firms. what has changed is that over time, people go to long-term care homes later and later, and that's also sicker and sicker. So yeah, so a long-term care home used to be something that maybe with 64, you went to this home to still make friends and so on. This nowadays not the case. So normally you go to the home when there's really no possibility to stay at home anymore at all. Yeah? And so it might be that over time, things have changed a bit because another share of the elderly population enters these homes. Yeah? So that is true, that this might also be behind our results.
Okay, thank you.
So I showed you the absolute entry threshold. So this is like, you know, you here, for example, you see a for-profit monopolist needs 1,000 consumers to break even. But we can also look at this in relative terms. So here the question would be, we would look at this, the entry threshold ratio. So how much more consumers does the nth firm need than the n-1 firm? Yeah, and so here an entry threshold larger than 1, entry threshold ratio, sorry, larger than 1 would indicate that you need a larger market size per firm when there's an additional entrant. And the idea here is that these entry threshold ratios measure how markups fall with entry. So if they actually go down, it means that you need more and more consumers to support an additional home, and that competition increases with entry. And only if they reach 1, so that if, you know, more and more firms enter, the number of consumers needed really doesn't change anymore. We think that we are in perfect competition, or we might also have ended up in a perfect cartel. So when we look at these entry threshold ratios, and we look at them always in 1999 and 2013, again, non-profit firms on the left, for-profit firms on the right, and we look at how we go from 1 to 2 firms, from 2 to 3, and from 3 to 4 more firms. We can see that these entry threshold ratios are clearly above 1. So yes, competition, entry increases competition. Yeah? So we are not yet in a perfectly competitive market, even at 4 firms. That's also important to note. And then, interestingly enough, these entry threshold ratios, they were steeper in 1999 than they are now in 2013. We saw this also on the other picture, that, you know, this kind of, these entry thresholds have fallen over time. So what would we think? Well, we would think that competition has become less fierce over time. And also note that the entry threshold ratios look much more similar in 2013 between non-profit and for-profit firms than they looked in 1999. So it seems really that non-profits and for-profit firms are converging, not only in their observable attributes, but also in their competitive behavior. And the last thing, because now we always only looked at own type, but we might, I mean, we are especially interested what happens between types, right? So what is if there are n own type firms in the market, and we get more and more firms of the other type in the market now? Does this hurt our profits? Is the market size needed larger when there are more other type firms in the market? Again, if an entry threshold ratio is larger than 1, this will indicate that a larger market size is needed to support N firms if there are more other type competitors. Note that this is now a total market effect, not per firm, and that we make this division by N, and this will fix how this effect diminishes with the number of own type firms in the market, but we left totally free, and we will estimate how this depends on the number of other type firms. So let's look at this graph. So here we look at the non-profit firms are in black, the for-profit firms are in red, and we want to see is what happens if we go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 other type firms. Remember, in 2013, 2013, we saw that the for-profit firms here in red, they are almost not affected by the presence of non-profit firms. They do not care. They do not lose consumers to non-profit firms. We use the effects were non-significant. We use the point estimates here, but they're very small. While non-profit firms, here in black, are affected quite strongly by the for-profit firms. Yeah, so these for-profit firms have really become serious competitors to the non-profit firms. And what's also interesting that this was exactly the other way around in 2013. So in 2013, it was the for-profit firms that were really suffering from the non-profit firms, not the other way around. So it seems that somehow these for-profit firms, we saw this also in the entry threshold ratios, maybe consumers have become, they dislike them less now, they've become used to them over time. Are there any questions here on the entry threshold ratios?
Yes, me again.
Yeah.
I don't know how to interpret that. Is it like you said that people get more used to for-profit firms, or that for-profit firms end up behaving like not-for-profit, so care more? You know, purely profit-minded people would have been weeded out of the market, and have private agents who actually have more care about helping people.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, yeah, this is the big question that will remain open in the end, because both I think is consistent with our results. Yeah, so it seems that, I mean, demand and cost parameters, maybe they haven't changed so much, because you have seen that these entry thresholds for the monopolists were pretty stable, right? Or demand and cost parameters have changed just in offsetting ways. But I think that both is possible. Yeah, that people change their, that either the firms change their behavior, and you can see that the quality has increased by quite a lot of these non-profit firms over time, or at least it has converged. Yeah, so there seems to be something going on, and I think also that in the beginning people were really very negative about for-profit firms in the long-term care sector, and I think it's becoming much more normal to have them in the market now. And the last thing I want to show you is to evaluate several policy proposals. One is to close or privatize the remaining public homes. The second, to eliminate the tax advantage that benefits the non-profit homes. And the last one, to have a quality regulation, namely to mandate that 95% of the rooms in the non-profit homes have to be single rooms. For each of these proposals, we want to see whether vulnerable markets remain or underserved. And we also have one where we just predict future market growth. Before I show you the simulations so that they don't fall from heaven, it's important to note that our model is equivalent to one with a multiplicative error. So recall that we used this kind of discrete choice formulation where we said that profits are made up of an observed and an unobserved part, and where we said that the observed part is just a function of log market size, observed characteristics, and the number of own and other type firms. So if we write a profit equation with a multiplicative error, namely one where we say that profits are a function of variable profits per consumer times market size times an error minus fixed costs. And we say that a firm will enter if profits are larger or equal to 0. And if we shuffle things around a bit, we see that this is equivalent to assuming that firms enter if log market size plus log variable profits per consumer per firm minus log fixed costs are larger than error term. So basically what we do with our specification is we assume that if anything changes in our market characteristics or the number of firm, this will affect log variable profits minus log fixed costs, or log variable profits over fixed costs. Yeah, so this is just, and then this will help us to make changes in the ratio to variable profits over fixed costs, and we can just translate this to changes in our profit equation. So this was just the background for our simulation. We do one benchmark simulation where we simulate the equilibrium 100 times in each market, and we use the observed variables for our market characteristics and the market size for 2013. Then we have a growth scenario, and here we use just predictions for market size in 10 years, and we make of our own predictions of all the other variables by just, you know, letting the growth rate of the last 15 years go on. Now with COVID, it's a bit questionable if this is a good way, but this is what we at least did 2 years ago when we did these simulations, or a year ago. What about the policy changes? Well, the one of thinking about no public homes is easy. We just set the variable to 0. And then when we say that we abolish the tax advantages of non-profit firms, we think it's completely unlikely that the government would just abolish these tax advantages from one day to the other, because then we would see a massive closure of homes. So we say, like, let's have the government redistribute these tax advantages between profit and non-profit firms, because the government might say, are these non-profit firms really so much better than the for-profit firms? Who knows? We just want to, you know, subsidize more fairly. And then the last thing is we want to impose a 95% single room mandate. This has actually been done in some regions in Germany, but maybe in the back of our heads we have to keep that this will be maybe very, very costly, because consumers like this most, but in our whole sample period, the share of single rooms has only increased by about 1 percentage point per year, so very slowly. So we think that for long-term care homes, it's very expensive to offer single rooms. And we'll assume that the cost of increasing to 95% will depend, of course, on the share that the home has at the moment already in single rooms. So this is the results of our simulations. So our benchmark simulation, where we always look at the total number of nursing homes in the market, the number of non-profit and for-profit homes, the unserved markets, that's something that we don't like. And we also don't like markets with only non-profits and only for-profits, because it seems that consumers value them differently. And so we would like consumers to have a choice. The nice thing about the benchmark is it looks pretty similar to the real market, so that's kind of reassuring. And what about predicted growth? So in predicted growth, we think that 10 years out, there will be about 14% more elderly population, and there will be income would have increased by about 8–9%. So what would happen to the total number of nursing homes? Well, reassuringly, this would increase by 11%. For-profits are more prone to enter the market, so we really depend on them. And these homes, we would predict, would especially enter in markets that are just below the threshold of a home entering. So the number of completely unserved markets would really go down by quite a lot. And also the market of with only non-profits would go down by a lot, because we would see a lot of for-profit entry. What happens if we take out about 5% of public homes? Well, we will get entry in response, but this entry will not be as large as, so we have a 3% increase in the number of homes, but we had a 5% decrease. So this will not fully compensate. We'll see especially entry of non-profits, because they are closer competitors, we think, to the government homes than are the for-profit firms. And we unfortunately we would see that the number of unserved markets would go up, and especially yeah, we would see more markets with only for-profit firms. What would happen if we would redistribute the tax exemption between for-profit and non-profit homes? Well, unfortunately, this would also lead to a loss in the number of nursing homes. Why? Well, first of all, because non-profit homes have this kind of they like to enter the market, they enter at a smaller market size, right? So if we now redistribute to for-profit homes, we'll have a loss in the number of homes. And the second effect why this is the case is that non-profit homes are hurt more by the presence of for-profit homes. Now, if we push more for-profit homes into the market, non-profit homes will exit. Yeah, so unfortunately, so the number of for-profit homes will increase, but the number of non-profit homes would decrease by even more. We'll have more unserved markets, and of course also many more markets with only for-profit firms. And lastly, what would happen for the single room policy? So we would think that this would lead to a massive exit of long-term care homes, minus 20%. Especially for-profit homes, Uppsala, especially for-profit homes would exit because they have a much lower share of single rooms at the moment. And unserved markets would really increase by a lot. So maybe it's not a good idea to have such a strict quality mandate from the government. Are there any questions on the results of the simulations here?
Not on the results per se, but why not having considered more tax exemptions? So broader tax exemptions also for profit.
Okay, so we now have just said we take the existing ones and redistribute, and you would say, okay, the government really likes this sector. Okay, no, it's just something to consider. Yeah, totally, thanks. Yeah, anything else?
Since there are no others, can you price the cost for the public sector, for the government, of having more public care homes in unserved markets versus reducing the tax rate for everyone?
Oh, okay. It's something that I would have to think about. So, like, let's say we take all public homes out. This saves the government quite a bit of money, and then we can redistribute this in taxes to or in subsidies.
No. I'm saying you have some unserved markets, which is, as you said, something very costly.
Yeah.
So why not? What happens if the government decides to invest there?
Yeah, okay.
So
put more
just in these unserved markets, or a blanket, so a fiscal incentive for everyone.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. It's also an interesting one. Okay, yeah, like
along the same lines, Iris. You have these universal service obligation for monopolies or whatever, the post office or whatever. You could here say, look, I'm ready in these unserved markets to give you a subsidy for entering there, but we have an auction, and therefore hopefully the auction will make sure that the subsidy will be just enough to make it profitable to enter, but not too much. And then you can allow for-profit and not-for-profits to bid.
Just to bid and to get there. Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting policy ideas. I think I can do a lot more simulations. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it will be interesting to see. Anything else that we should think about?
Just as a reminder, we would like to have a more open discussion also towards the end. So let us know when that's convenient for you.
So I'll just conclude here. So what do we learn? So one thing maybe that long-term care homes really actively compete with one another. The within and between entry threshold ratios are well above 1. So competition increases with entry, and this even when we're at 4 or more firms. So competition is a lot stronger within type than between types. So this suggests that we really have a segmented market. But we also saw lots of changes over time. So in the beginning, the for-profit firms were really hurt much more by the non-profit firms. They're competing very strongly with each other. They might have had very elastic consumers, but over time this has changed. And now these for-profit firms are really competitors for the non-profit firms. And this is maybe what we like, because of course, these non-profit firms already have quite a lot of advantages through these tax advantages. Over time, the entry thresholds for high-end have fallen. The entry threshold ratios have become flatter. So firms seem to compete less now than they used to do. I don't know whether we like this. And the change was especially pronounced for for-profit homes. So maybe they learned most over time. Our simulations indicate that the proposed policy changes would have really large effects, and that especially fragile markets would be disproportionately affected. So I guess it's just a note of caution to not, make big policy changes that are not very well thought through from one moment to the other, because we will see large effects on the number of homes. Okay, thank you. That was it from my side. And yeah, now.
Thank you so much, Iris, for a fascinating seminar. I think the last part is summarizes well the interest of these multidisciplinary seminars, where we can start thinking about health policies, including the effects of the market, etc. And so the time is perfect. So I would like to invite any other participants or attendee to ask questions. You just please raise your hand, and we will be able to introduce your questions. Thank you again, Iris.
Thank you. Lots of good questions here.
And Hilde, maybe.
Yes, we had a more general question from Matthias, who was indeed the co-director of the I3h Institute. Matthias?
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Iris, for a very nice seminar. I think that to have a broad question, how should we think about the universe with your paper?
Okay.
I remember I was struck by this saying by 20 years ago by then Prime Minister of France, socialist Lionel Jospin, that he was engaging in privatization, something like that. And so he said that he would not go too far, because he said that he liked a market economy, but not a market society.
Mm-hmm.
That now, of course, things like health, education, and the like, they are at the limit of where. So in this case, where even now in regular economic sectors, there is a lot of debate about shareholder values and the difficulties of that, and the fact that we have to move to stakeholder value. Now, the not-for-profit model is a concrete way to go there. Mm-hmm. So here, you make a simulation getting rid totally of public sector firms, but you don't look, for example, I understand it may not be realistic, but it might be interesting to look at what happens if we get rid of for-profit firms or if we get rid of not-for-profit firms. Okay. And is that good or bad? You already show in your simulation that, for example, as can be expected, if a for-profit firm go away, then you have this problem of fragile, underserved markets. Now, is your model an interesting tool to look at these bigger questions? And as I say, I'm not talking about the current politics. But I thought that, it seemed to me that there's a lot of potential there for asking these kind of questions.
Yeah, so I think one important thing to look at is that really consumers seem to value, or we can really show that consumers value non-profit and for-profit firms differently, and that different consumers differ them differently. So I think it is important to have both of them in the market, and this really is welfare increasing. One other thing is that we see that these non-profit firms, they serve also different types of markets. I haven't really showed you these simulations, but it is really that these firms are distributed differently within Germany. So, for example, the for-profit firms really don't like the east of Germany so much. And so if we would, you know, just say, oh, let's get rid of the non-profit or the non-profit tax advantage, that would really hurt specific regions a lot. So I think it's actually good that these two types of firms compete with each other. I also think that there's a certain danger in these non-profit firms, at least in Germany, where they're really heavily depend on the churches. So people are exiting the churches like crazy. And we know, and I don't know, my co-author wasn't so interested in this simulation because he said, oh, it's so Germany specific. But I mean, we know that the churches have much less money available in the future. Germany is a strange country, right, where you are taxed, where the government takes taxes if you're a member of a church and gives this to the churches. So it's the country with the richest churches in the world. But this is just now massively changing, and that is of course a danger, that the government pulls out all these public firms. And we might be, you know, seeing big changes in the future when the churches reduce their engagement in these non-profit firms. And I don't know who should take this over. Any more questions?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So it seems that we are converging to the end of the seminar. Just as a reminder, the seminar is being recorded and so will be made available on the I3h website. I want to thank you again so much, Iris, for this very interesting seminar, and as we saw, raising pretty important questions as well.
Yeah,
thank you very much, and
Very happy.
have a good day to all.